Imagine stepping out the door in the year 740. And where could you go? What would hold you back? What if you were a woman? Number 10. Lack of education and literacy. In the world of 740, knowledge was not something widely accessible to everyone. And for women across the vast majority of human societies, the path to formal learning was often closed off, or at best, incredibly narrow. This profound lack of widespread education and literacy played a quiet yet incredibly powerful role in limiting women's movement and travel, creating an invisible barrier that stretched far beyond city walls or dusty roads. When we consider how people navigated the world, how they understood opportunities, and how they even conceived of places beyond their immediate horizon, a lack of literacy becomes a significant hurdle. Think about it. How do you know where to go if you cannot read a map? How do you understand the purpose of a journey if you cannot read documents, royal decrees, or merchant ledgers that might dictate routes or permissions? 4. The vast majority of women information about the world beyond their village or immediate urban district came through spoken word, through the stories of travelers, through the commands of their male relatives, or through the limited scope of their own daily observations. This meant that their understanding of geography, of political structures, of economic opportunities, and even of the dangers lurking in different regions was often second-hand, filtered, and incomplete. A woman who could not read was reliant on others to interpret the world for her, to guide her, and often to decide her movements. Consider the practicalities of travel even for a short distance. In a world without printed signs or widespread public information, knowing a route often involved reading written directions, recognizing place names, or understanding the written language of tolls or permissions. While most travel was guided by word of mouth and the knowledge of local guides, a fundamental inability to engage with written information meant a profound dependence on others. If a woman needed to travel for trade, an uncommon but not unheard of occurrence, for some women, particularly in certain urban centers or specialized craft communities, her inability to read would severely limit her capacity to manage accounts, verify transactions. This dependence often meant that if a woman did travel for economic reasons, she would almost invariably be accompanied by a literate male relative or a servant who could handle the written aspects of the journey and business. Moreover, a lack of formal education often meant a lack of understanding about the world beyond one's immediate community. Geography was learned through local knowledge, not through extensive study of maps or texts. History was passed down through oral traditions, not through written chronicles. Law and governance were often understood through observation of local customs and the commands of authorities, not through engagement with written legal codes. This limited conceptual framework for the wider world could itself act as a deterrent to travel. Why venture into the unknown if you lack the mental tools to comprehend its complexities or navigate its challenges? The very idea of independent movement to a distant place might seem daunting, if not impossible, to someone whose entire understanding of the world was confined to the boundaries of spoken narrative and personal experience. The impact of literacy on power and autonomy was profound. In many societies of 740, and particularly those influenced by highly textual religions like Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, literacy was intrinsically linked to spiritual authority and moral guidance. For women, access to religious texts was often mediated through male figures, whether priests, imams, or family elders. This meant that interpretations of religious laws or social norms that dictated women's roles and movements were often presented without the opportunity for women to engage directly with the original texts themselves. A woman who could not read sacred scriptures was therefore less equipped to question or challenge interpretations that might restrict her freedom of movement, both physically and intellectually. Her understanding of her place in the world and the boundaries of her permissible actions was largely shaped by others. Even within aristocratic or wealthy families, where girls might receive some form of education, It was often tailored to domestic management, artistic pursuits like music or poetry, or basic religious instruction rather than practical skills like geography, arithmetic for trade, or legal knowledge that might facilitate. While some exceptional women, particularly abbesses in Christian monasteries or some noble women, were renowned for their learning and even literacy, these were the rare exceptions, not the rule. For the vast majority of women, even those of privilege, the kind of practical literacy that would empower independent movement was not a priority in their education. This pervasive lack of literacy also meant that women had limited avenues for communicating with people in distant places. In an era before instant communication, letters were the primary means of sending messages over long distances. A woman who could not read or write was entirely dependent on scribes or literate family members to compose and interpret her correspondence. This dependence could complicate travel plans, restrict the sharing of vital information, or even make it impossible to arrange for safe passage or accommodation in unfamiliar territories without male assistance. The ability to send and receive letters autonomously would have been a significant enabler of independent movement, and its absence created another layer of limitation. Furthermore, the very act of record-keeping, essential for any significant journey or relocation, was largely in the hands of the literate. Land deeds, travel permits, financial records, and even records of birth or marriage that might be required for identification were all written documents. A woman without literacy could not verify the accuracy of these documents, could not independently manage her own affairs in written form, and was therefore highly vulnerable to manipulation or misunderstanding when dealing with officials or merchants in distant locations. This vulnerability often necessitated male guardianship or accompaniment for any travel beyond the most familiar routes. So, while it might not seem as dramatic as a physical chain or a locked door, the widespread lack of education and literacy for women in 740-odd was a fundamental systemic limitation on their movement and travel. It created dependence, limited knowledge, fostered vulnerability, and subtly but powerfully reinforced the idea that a woman's place was primarily within the confines of her familiar community, under the guidance and protection of others. It was a limitation woven into the very fabric of society, shaping minds and determining destinies without a single visible barrier. Number 9. Dress codes and modesty requirements. Imagine trying to navigate the bustling markets of Baghdad or the muddy paths of an Anglo-Saxon village, not just concerned with your destination, but constantly aware of how every inch of your body was perceived. In 740, and for women across diverse cultures, what you wore wasn't just a matter of fashion. It was a deeply ingrained social and religious mandate that heavily dictated your movement and ability to travel. Dress codes, particularly those emphasizing modesty and concealment, served as potent, often unspoken limitations on women's freedom to move and explore the world beyond their immediate homes. These requirements weren't just about appearances, they impacted comfort, practicality, and crucially, a woman's perceived safety and reputation in any public space, especially when traveling. Consider the physical burden. In many regions, particularly those influenced by nascent Islamic traditions or certain Christian ascetic practices, women were expected to wear multiple layers of heavy, flowing garments. This often included long tunics, outer cloaks, and head coverings, sometimes extending to veils that obscured the face. While providing protection from the elements in harsh climates, these layers were also cumbersome. Imagine walking for miles over rough terrain, or even simply moving through a crowded city, burdened by heavy lengths of material that could trip you, snag on obstacles, or make it incredibly difficult to move quickly or discreetly. The sheer physical effort required to carry these garments, especially in hot climates, would have been exhausting and certainly not conducive to long, arduous journeys. Mobility was literally hampered by the weight and bulk of mandated attire. Beyond the physical inconvenience, these garments were often designed to minimize the distinctiveness of a woman's form, to blend her into a general undifferentiated presence in public. While this could offer a degree of anonymity, it also made a woman less recognizable and thus, in some contexts, more vulnerable. In an unfamiliar place, being able to move with agility, to respond quickly to a situation, or to present a clear identity might be crucial for safety. Heavy, restrictive clothing could impede these abilities. Furthermore, garments that obscured the face, while intended for modesty, could make communication with strangers difficult, further isolating a woman from assistance or interaction in an unfamiliar environment. The social implications of dress codes were perhaps even more restrictive. In many societies, a woman's reputation and the honor of her family were inextricably linked to her modesty and her adherence to prescribed dress. To be seen in public without the proper head covering, or in clothing deemed immodest, could invite severe social censure, suspicion, and even accusations of impropriety. This was not merely a matter of social awkwardness, it could have devastating consequences, potentially leading to ostracization, violence, or a ruined future. This constant pressure to conform, to project an image of impeccable modesty, acted as a powerful internal governor on a woman's movement. Even if there were no physical barriers, the psychological burden of maintaining social approval, especially when traveling through unknown communities with different customs, would have been immense. A woman would hesitate to travel if she felt uncertain about the local expectations of dress, fearing the grave consequences of a misstep. Moreover, the prescribed attire often marked a woman as belonging to a certain status or group, making her visible in specific ways. For example, the clothing of a married woman might differ from that of an unmarried woman, or a woman from a wealthy family might wear different materials or styles than a woman from a poorer household. While this offered social cues, it also meant that a woman's presence, especially in public or unfamiliar places, was immediately categorized and judged. This could make her a target for those who wished to exploit her perceived vulnerability or wealth, or it could simply reinforce the idea that her movements were subject to public scrutiny. In contrast, men's clothing, while also carrying social markers, rarely imposed the same degree of physical restriction or reputational burden tied to every public appearance. The practicalities of travel, too, were affected. Imagine trying to manage a household, care for children, or even engage in trade while burdened by cumbersome layers. The ability to move efficiently, to handle goods, or to perform labor was inherently limited by clothing designed for sedentary display rather than active participation in the outside world. This implicitly reinforced the idea that women's primary sphere of activity was within the home, where these garments might be slightly less restrictive, or where the social gaze was less intense. Travel, by its very nature, required a degree of practicality and adaptability that many prescribed dress codes actively hindered. Even for women in monastic communities, where some degree of physical freedom might have been granted for spiritual purposes, their attire was often distinct and often signaled their withdrawal from the secular world. The habits of nuns, for instance, were designed to be modest and often restrictive, emphasizing their commitment to a life removed from worldly temptations. While this allowed for movement within monastic enclosures or for sanctioned spiritual journeys, it was a movement governed by the strictures of their religious order rather than personal autonomy. In essence, dress codes and modesty requirements in 740 AD acted as a pervasive, culturally enforced straitjacket on women's movement and travel. They dictated not only what a woman wore, but where she could go, how she could move, and how she would be perceived. The threat of social censure, the physical discomfort of heavy clothing, and a very visible signaling of a woman's modesty or lack thereof combined to create a powerful disincentive for independent travel, subtly but effectively keeping women tethered to the perceived safety and moral confines of their familiar communities. Number 8. Domestic responsibilities and child care. Picture this. The sun rises over a small village, or perhaps the bustling streets of a developing city in 740 AD. For the vast majority of women, their day began not with the prospect of travel or exploration, but with an immediate and unyielding list of tasks tied directly to their home and family. Domestic responsibilities and the relentless demands of childcare formed a powerful, invisible tether, anchoring women firmly to their dwelling and severely limiting their ability to move or embark on journeys, even short ones beyond the immediate vicinity of their village or neighborhood. This wasn't just about preferences, it was about survival. For the entire family life in 740, and especially for common folk, was physically demanding. Every meal, every clean garment, every drop of water, and every bit of warmth required constant labor. Women were the primary managers of the household, a role that encompassed a vast array of tasks that were essential for daily living. Fetching water, which might involve a long walk to a well or river multiple times a day, was a continuous chore. Preparing food meant grinding grains, tending to hearths, cooking over open fires, and preserving provisions. Cleaning, spinning thread, weaving cloth, making and mending garments. These were not hobbies, but vital activities that consumed countless hours. The sheer volume of this work meant that a woman's presence in the home was not merely desired, but functionally necessary for the household to operate. To leave for any extended period would mean a collapse of daily routines, impacting the family's ability to feed, clothe, and care for themselves. Then there was childcare, a responsibility that often began at a very young age and continued for many years. In an era before widespread public education or readily available childcare options, mothers were the primary caregivers for infants, toddlers, and young children. Infancy was a period of high mortality, and constant supervision and nursing were crucial. Children were often carried everywhere, strapped to their mothers' backs or hips, or kept close at hand. Imagine trying to embark on a long journey, perhaps by foot or on a slow, bumpy cart, while simultaneously caring for multiple young children, nursing an infant, and ensuring their safety and well-being in unfamiliar and potentially dangerous environments. The logistical nightmare alone would have been a significant deterrent. The demands of childcare also extended beyond infancy. As children grew, mothers were responsible for their early education, instilling social norms, teaching basic skills, and ensuring their moral upbringing. This constant presence and guidance were seen as fundamental to raising productive members of society. To be absent for extended periods would be seen as a dereliction of duty, potentially harming the children's development and the family's reputation. Furthermore, domestic labor was often interwoven with small-scale economic activities that took place within or very near the home. Many women contributed to the household economy through activities like spinning, weaving, making pottery, brewing ale, or raising small livestock. These activities, while providing essential income or goods, also tethered women to their homes, as the production process was often labor-intensive and required constant attention. To leave for travel meant abandoning these vital income-generating tasks, which most families could not afford. The cycles of pregnancy and childbirth also profoundly impacted women's ability to travel. In an era without modern medicine, childbirth was a perilous event, and the recovery period could be long and debilitating. A woman might be pregnant or recovering from childbirth for a significant portion of her reproductive years. Even outside these immediate periods, the responsibility of caring for a newborn and subsequent young children meant that long-distance travel, especially alone or without extensive support, was simply not feasible for many years of a woman's adult life. The fear of childbirth complications on the road or the inability to properly care for a child in difficult travel conditions would naturally deter any but the most urgent journeys. Social expectations reinforced these domestic roles. A woman's worth and her family's respectability were often tied to her diligence in managing the household and raising children. Neglecting these duties, even for sanctioned travel, could invite criticism and damage social standing. In many communities, a woman's public presence was already limited, and her primary sphere of influence was the home. To travel outside this sphere, particularly without a compelling reason and proper male escort, could be viewed with suspicion, suggesting a shirking of responsibilities or a desire for improper adventures. While men often had their own economic responsibilities that might take them away from home, such as farming, hunting, trading, or military service, their domestic duties were generally far less intensive and did not involve the same constant day-in, day-out physical presence required for childcare. This division of labor, deeply ingrained in societies of 740, had meant that men had far greater inherent flexibility to leave their homes for extended periods, knowing that the domestic sphere would continue to function under the care of women. In essence, the unrelenting demands of domestic life and childcare created a powerful practical limitation on women's movement and travel in 740. These responsibilities were not just duties. They were the very foundation of daily survival and social order. To move freely, to embark on journeys, would often mean abandoning these critical functions, a choice that was rarely viable and often socially unacceptable. It was a silent, exhausting force that kept women rooted in their homes year after year, generation after generation. Number 7. Health and hygiene challenges. Imagine living in a world where the slightest cut could lead to a fatal infection, where clean water was a luxury, and where diseases like dysentery, smallpox, or tuberculosis were constant, terrifying threats. For women in 740, these pervasive health and hygiene challenges were not just uncomfortable realities. They were fundamental limitations on their movement and ability to travel, often far more debilitating than any legal or social barrier. From the perils of childbirth to the lack of basic sanitation, women faced a unique set of vulnerabilities that tethered them to their immediate familiar environments. Childbirth stands as perhaps the most significant health-related limitation. In 740, having a child was incredibly dangerous. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high, and many women died from complications during or after labor, such as hemorrhage, infection, or eclampsia. Even for those who survived, the physical toll of frequent pregnancies and childbirths was immense. A woman might be pregnant or recovering from childbirth for much of her reproductive years, a period that could span from her teenage years well into her 30s or 40s. This meant extended periods of physical weakness, vulnerability, and dependence, making any significant travel extremely risky or impossible. The fear of going into labor on the road, far from midwives and familiar support networks, would have been a powerful deterrent to travel for any pregnant woman, or one with young infants. Even without explicit rules, the physical reality of pregnancy and recovery naturally confined women to their homes or nearby communities. Beyond childbirth, general health conditions were precarious. Average life expectancy was significantly lower than today, and childhood diseases were rampant. Women often bore the brunt of caring for sick family members, especially children, which further limited their ability to leave the household. Constant presence of endemic diseases meant that even short journeys could expose one to new infections, and the lack of understanding of germ theory meant that hygiene practices during travel were virtually non-existent by modern standards. Traveling often meant sleeping in crowded, unsanitary conditions, sharing water sources, and having limited access to clean personal hygiene, all of which increased the risk of illness. For women, who were often responsible for preparing food and caring for the sick, this exposure risk was constant. The realities of menstruation also played a role. In a world without modern sanitary products, managing menstruation, especially during travel, would have presented significant logistical and social challenges. While practices varied by culture, the discomfort, potential for visible staining, and the need for frequent washing or changing of absorbent materials in an environment with limited privacy and clean water would have made travel during these times profoundly unpleasant. While not a complete barrier, It added another layer of practical difficulty to any journey. Furthermore, access to medical care was incredibly limited and localized. Outside of major urban centers, medical knowledge was often based on traditional remedies, superstitions, and the skills of local healers or midwives. There were no widespread hospitals or clinics. If a woman fell ill while traveling, especially in an unfamiliar territory, her chances of receiving effective care were slim, and the risks of her condition worsening or proving fatal were high. This fear of illness, far from home, without access to trusted care, would naturally discourage women from embarking on journeys. The very infrastructure of travel was detrimental to health. Roads were often rough, dusty, or muddy. Transportation methods like walking, riding animals, or traveling in carts were slow, arduous, and exposed travelers to the elements, increasing the risk of respiratory illnesses, injuries, or dehydration. For women, who might already be physically weakened by childbirth or frequent pregnancies, these conditions posed even greater risks. The physical strain of travel could exacerbate existing health issues or trigger new ones. Moreover, the lack of private and clean sanitation facilities along travel routes presented a unique challenge for women. In an era where public hygiene was rudimentary at best, finding suitable and safe places for bodily functions, especially for women who were often more concerned with privacy and modesty, would have been difficult and often uncomfortable. This practical concern, while seemingly minor, could contribute to the overall discomfort and deterrence of long-distance travel. In essence, the brutal health realities of 740 add from the ever-present dangers of childbirth to the constant threat of disease and the primitive state of hygiene, created a powerful and deeply personal limitation on women's movement and travel. These challenges weren't about social rules or legal decrees. They were about the very physical vulnerability of the female body in a harsh and unforgiving world. They anchored women to the places where they could find familiar care, safe birthing conditions, and a modicum of cleanliness, making ventures into the unknown a gamble with their very lives. Number 6. Logistical barriers and primitive transportation. Imagine needing to cross a vast desert, a treacherous mountain range, or even just the muddy expanse between two villages in 740 AD. Now, imagine doing so without paved roads, reliable maps, or even the simplest modern vehicles. The world was vast, distances were immense, and the very act of movement was an epic undertaking, fraught with danger and immense difficulty. While these logistical barriers and primitive transportation methods affected everyone, they disproportionately limited women's movement and travel, adding layers of complexity and vulnerability that often make journeys impractical or impossible. Most travel was done on foot, by riding animals like horses, donkeys, or camels, or in slow, often uncomfortable carts drawn by animals. Roads were often little more than well-trodden paths, prone to turning into quagmires in rain or choking dust bowls in dry seasons. Bridges were scarce, and rivers often had to be forded or crossed by precarious ferries. A journey of what we might consider a few hours today could easily take days or weeks. This immense time commitment meant that any travel, even for relatively short distances, required significant planning, resources, and dedication. For women, who were already tethered by domestic responsibilities and childcare, dedicating weeks or months to travel was often an untenable luxury. The lack of reliable infrastructure was a huge hurdle. There were no widespread guest houses, rest stops, or organized supply chains along routes. Travelers had to carry almost everything they needed: food, water, bedding, and protective gear. Finding safe shelter at night was a constant concern, often leading to reliance on the hospitality of strangers, or camping in the open with all its inherent dangers. For women, who often had to travel with children or were simply more vulnerable to attack, the absence of secure stopping points was a major deterrent. The necessity of carrying supplies also limited mobility, as women often had less physical strength to carry heavy loads than men, and their clothing might be less suited to the rigors of backpacking. Navigation itself was a monumental challenge. There were no widespread accurate maps as we understand them today. Knowledge of routes was passed down through oral tradition, through the experience of seasoned travelers, or through the guidance of local escorts. This meant that venturing into unknown territory was a true leap of faith, requiring trust in guides or a deep familiarity with the landscape. For women, who generally had less opportunity for extensive travel or interaction with diverse groups of people, their personal geographical knowledge was often limited to their immediate vicinity, making independent long-distance travel a daunting prospect. Hiring animals, guides, and guards, purchasing supplies and paying tolls where they existed could be incredibly expensive, putting long-distance travel out of reach for all but the wealthiest. Since most women in 740-odd had limited or no independent economic resources, they were almost entirely dependent on male relatives to fund any journey. This economic dependence, coupled with the high cost of travel itself, often meant that journeys for women were only undertaken out of extreme necessity, such as marriage arrangements, family relocation, or religious pilgrimage, and even then usually as part of a larger group or caravan organized and financed by men. Furthermore, the very methods of transport were often unsuited to women, particularly if they were pregnant, elderly, or traveling with young children. Riding a horse or camel for days on end could be physically excruciating. Carts were bumpy, slow, and offered little in the way of comfort or privacy. The physical demands of simply enduring the journey itself were immense, potentially leading to exhaustion, injury, or worsening existing health conditions. This inherent physical difficulty of travel further reinforced the idea that women were better off remaining in their fixed domestic sphere. Security, or the lack thereof, was an overarching logistical concern. Travel routes were notoriously unsafe, plagued by bandits, wild animals, and the constant threat of intertribal or regional conflicts. Caravans, while offering some protection in numbers, moved slowly and were still vulnerable. For a woman, particularly traveling without male escort, the risk of abduction, assault, or enslavement was incredibly high. This pervasive danger meant that women's travel was almost always undertaken within a protected group, under the care of male relatives, or with hired guards, severely limiting their independent movement. The concept of a woman traveling alone for leisure or personal exploration was almost unthinkable due to these extreme dangers. In summary, the logistical barriers and primitive transportation methods of 740 had created a world where movement was inherently difficult, dangerous, and expensive. While these challenges faced all travelers, they disproportionately impacted women, compounding their existing social, legal, and economic limitations. The sheer time commitment, lack of safe infrastructure, difficulties in navigation, high costs, physical demands of transport, and pervasive security risks combined to make independent or even accompanied travel for women a rare and often perilous undertaking, cementing their role as primarily homebound individuals. Number 5. Economic dependence and lack of personal wealth. Imagine wanting to embark on a journey to see a new place, to visit a distant relative, or even to escape a difficult situation, but having absolutely no money of your own to make it happen. For the vast majority of women in 740, this was not just a hypothetical scenario, it was a deeply ingrained reality. Economic dependence and a pervasive lack of personal wealth created an invisible but incredibly strong chain, limiting women's movement and travel more profoundly than almost any other factor. In a world where every journey, no matter how small, incurred costs, a woman's inability to control or possess her own finances was a fundamental barrier to her autonomy and mobility. Across most societies of 740, women had very limited rights to own, inherit, or control property and wealth independently. While there were exceptions, some noblewomen or widows might manage estates, and certain legal systems, like some interpretations of Islamic law, granted women some property rights. These were often in specific circumstances and did not represent a norm for the vast majority of women. For the common woman, wealth was typically held by male relatives, fathers, husbands, brothers, or sons. A woman's economic life was often subsumed into the larger household economy, managed by its male head. This meant she had little to no independent access to funds for personal needs, let alone for travel. Every aspect of travel required resources. Transportation, whether hiring a horse, securing passage on a boat, or paying for a space in a caravan, cost money. Food and lodging along the route, even in the most basic inns or through local hospitality, came with a price, either directly or indirectly. Protection from bandits or hostile groups often required hiring guards, a significant expense. Even securing basic necessities for the journey, like durable clothing or provisions, demanded funds. Without personal wealth, a woman could not initiate or fund any of these essential elements of travel. She was entirely reliant on the willingness of a male relative to provide the necessary funds, and this willingness was often dictated by family interests, economic necessity, or social propriety, rather than a woman's personal desire to travel. This economic dependence meant that a woman's ability to travel was almost always conditional. A father might allow a daughter to travel for a prearranged marriage, or a husband might permit his wife to visit her family in a neighboring village, but these journeys were initiated and paid for by the men, often serving their purposes rather than the woman's independent will. Travel for personal leisure, curiosity, or self-improvement was largely unheard of for women of any social standing precisely because it offered no direct economic or social benefit to the male head of the household and represented an expense without clear return. Even for women who engaged in productive labor, their earnings were often not their own. In many societies, a woman's labor, whether in the fields, in crafts, or within the home, was considered part of her contribution to the household, and any income generated was controlled by the male head. This meant that even if a woman produced goods for sale, she might not have direct access to the profits to fund her own independent ventures. The notion of a woman accumulating personal savings for a journey was largely foreign. The lack of economic independence also meant that a woman had little leverage to negotiate her own movements. If a dispute arose during travel, or if she needed to make an urgent payment, she was powerless without the means to do so. This vulnerability reinforced the idea that women needed male escorts or guardians when outside the home, as they simply lacked the economic tools to navigate the world independently. A woman traveling alone without visible means or the protection of a male relative would be incredibly vulnerable to exploitation, theft, or worse, precisely because she lacked the economic power to protect herself. Contrast this with men who, while also facing economic constraints, generally had greater rights to inherit, own, and control property, engage in trade, and earn independent wages. This fundamental difference in economic agency meant that men could, at least in principle, choose to save, invest, and spend their own money on travel, whether for business, pilgrimage, or even adventure. This option was largely absent for women. In essence, the economic realities of 740 had created a pervasive and debilitating limitation on women's movement and travel. Without control over wealth, women could not fund their own journeys, could not negotiate their own terms, and were largely at the mercy of male relatives to determine if and when they might leave their homes. It was a silent, powerful force that kept women economically dependent and, by extension, geographically confined, reinforcing their primary role within the domestic sphere. Number 4. Physical danger and security concerns. Imagine stepping out into a world where every journey, even a short one, carried a palpable threat of violence, abduction, or sudden death. For women in 740, and the pervasive physical danger and security concerns were not merely an inconvenience, they were a terrifying, ever-present reality that profoundly limited their movement and travel. The roads and waterways were not safe havens. They were often lawless frontiers, plagued by bandits, deserters, wild animals, and the unpredictable ebb and flow of regional conflicts. For a woman, venturing out without significant protection was an unthinkable risk, making independent travel virtually impossible, and even accompanied journeys fraught with peril. Banditry was rampant across the known world. Whether in the forested routes of Anglo-Saxon England, the desert caravans of the nascent Abbasid Caliphate, or the mountain passes of Tang China, travelers were prime targets for thieves and organized gangs. These groups sought not just goods or money, but also people for ransom or enslavement. For women, the risk was even greater, as they were often valued for their potential as captives, concubines, or slaves. The fear of being kidnapped, assaulted, or sold into servitude was a constant, legitimate terror that overshadowed any thought of independent travel. A woman traveling alone or even with a small, unprotected group was an immediate and obvious target. Beyond common banditry, the Jialing landscape of 740 AD was characterized by frequent warfare, skirmishes, and political instability. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, and local lords constantly vied for power. Traveling through regions affected by conflict meant risking encountering marauding armies, hostile patrols, or desperate deserters. Such encounters could lead to violence, pillaging, and the abduction of women. Even in times of relative peace, the remnants of past conflicts, displaced populations, weapons caches, and lingering hostilities contributed to a climate of insecurity on the roads. For women, being caught in such a situation, especially without male protectors, was a horrific prospect. The very concept of a neutral, safe public space for women was often tenuous. While markets and certain religious sites might offer a degree of protection within cities, the routes between settlements were wilderness. Wild animals from wolves to bears posed a direct physical threat, especially when traveling on foot or camping outdoors. Accidents, such as falling from a horse, a cart, overturning, or drowning during a river crossing, were common and often fatal in an age without emergency services. For women who might be physically weaker or less experienced in navigating rugged terrain, these environmental dangers were amplified. The social and cultural norms of the time also played a significant role in magnifying these dangers for women. In many societies, a woman's honor was closely tied to her physical purity and her reputation. Being assaulted or abducted, regardless of her innocence, could irrevocably ruin her and her family's social standing. This fear of dishonor, combined with the real threat of physical harm, meant that families were highly protective of their women, often restricting their movements as a primary means of safeguarding their honor and physical safety. Perceived dangers were so great that the benefits of travel rarely outweighed the risks to a woman's reputation and well-being. This pervasive insecurity meant that any significant travel for women almost invariably required male escort or inclusion in a large, well-guarded caravan. Fathers, husbands, brothers, or hired guards were considered essential for protection. This reliance on male protectors, while born out of a legitimate concern for safety, inherently limited a woman's autonomy. She could only travel if a suitable escort was available and willing, and her route, pace, and destination were largely dictated by their needs and the perceived level of security. The very idea of a woman striking out on her own for adventure or personal desire was not only socially unacceptable but also extremely dangerous, bordering on suicidal, even within religious contexts, where pilgrimage might necessitate travel. Women were still expected to be part of organized groups or family units. For example, women undertaking a pilgrimage to Mecca or to Christian holy sites would join large caravans, benefiting from the collective safety they offered. The journey was still arduous and dangerous, but the presence of many travelers and armed guards mitigated some of the risks. However, this was still not independent travel. It was travel under the protective umbrella of a larger, male-dominated group. In conclusion, the brutal realities of physical danger and security concerns in 740 were arguably one of the most immediate and terrifying limitations on women's movement and travel. From bandits and warring factions to wild animals and the constant threat of assault or abduction, the world beyond the immediate homestead was a perilous place. This pervasive insecurity compelled families and societies to restrict women's movements as a matter of protection, effectively anchoring them to their communities and making any independent journey a terrifying gamble with their lives and honor. Number 3. Religious doctrines and interpretations. Imagine a spiritual framework that dictates not just your beliefs, but also how you live your daily life, including where you can go and how you present yourself. In 740, religion was not a separate sphere of life. It permeated every aspect of society, and for women, its doctrines and their interpretations often served as powerful, divine justifications for limiting their movement and travel. Across regions influenced by burgeoning Islam, established Christianity, and enduring traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, religious teachings as understood and enforced by male religious authorities and societal norms profoundly shaped the boundaries of women's permissible physical journeys. In the nascent Islamic world, which was expanding rapidly in 740, religious texts and scholarly interpretations emphasized the concept of purdah or seclusion for women. While the Quran itself does not explicitly mandate complete segregation or veiling, the interpretations and cultural practices that developed in the early Islamic centuries often led to women being largely confined to the home. Their public appearances were minimized, and if they did venture out, it was typically in extensive covering that obscured their form and face, and often with a male guardian. Travel for women was generally considered permissible only if it was for essential purposes, such as pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj, or if it was part of a necessary relocation, always accompanied by a mahram, a male relative, like a father, husband, or brother. The theological reasoning often centered on protecting women's modesty and honor, and by extension, the honor of their families, from the temptations and dangers of the outside world. This religious injunction therefore directly limited women's independent movement and subjected their travel to male approval and escort. In the Christian world, particularly within the Byzantine Empire and various emerging European kingdoms, the emphasis on women's piety, chastity, and domestic roles also influenced their mobility. While monasticism offered some women a form of structured movement within the confines of convents and for sanctioned religious duties, the vast majority of Christian women were expected to embody virtues of meekness and submission, primarily within the home. Church teachings often warned against women's independent ventures into the public sphere, associating such activities with moral danger and temptation. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common for both men and women. But for women, these journeys were almost always undertaken as part of a family unit or an organized group under the spiritual and physical protection of men. The emphasis on avoiding temptation and maintaining purity subtly discouraged solitary or unauthorized travel for women. In Hindu societies of the Indian subcontinent, traditional roles for women were often tied to domesticity and family honor. Religious texts and social customs, dharma, emphasized the woman's role as the keeper of the home and the family's spiritual well-being. While women participated in religious festivals and local pilgrimages, their movement, especially across long distances, was generally regulated and limited by family expectations and the pervasive concern for Stri Dharma, or women's sacred duties, which largely centered on the household. The concept of parda, similar to purdah, also existed in various forms, especially among upper castes, further restricting public visibility and independent movement. Even in Buddhist contexts, while the monastic orders offered women a path to spiritual pursuit and some prominent female figures existed, the general societal norms often mirrored patriarchal structures. For lay women, While freedom might have been relatively higher in some regions compared to others, the overarching cultural and religious narrative often placed a primary emphasis on domestic roles and familiar responses. Across these diverse religious landscapes, a common thread was the interpretation of religious texts and traditions by male authorities. These interpretations often reinforced existing social hierarchies, positioning men as protectors and guardians, and women as those who needed protection and guidance. The justification for limiting women's movement was often framed as a divine mandate to safeguard their virtue, ensure their spiritual well-being, and maintain societal order. Travel, particularly independent travel, was seen as exposing women to moral dangers, tempting encounters, and physical threats, all of which were deemed contrary to their religious duties and the family's honor. Furthermore, religious holidays, festivals, and communal gatherings often required physical presence at specific temples, mosques, or churches. While this might seem to encourage movement, for women it often meant regulated, highly structured movement within their community, under the watchful eye of family and religious leaders. It rarely translated into freedom to explore or travel independently beyond these sanctioned, often ritualized journeys. In essence, religious doctrines and their prevailing interpretations in 740 had created a powerful and deeply ingrained system of control over women's movement and travel. By associating women's honor, spiritual purity, and family respectability with their seclusion and protection, religious authorities and societal norms effectively enshrined limitations on their mobility as a divine imperative. This spiritual and moral framework, far from being a mere suggestion, was a guiding principle that shaped daily life and made independent travel for women not just difficult, but often morally condemned and religiously forbidden without explicit male guardianship. Number 2. Legal restrictions and property rights. Imagine a world where your decisions about where you live, what you own, and even who you marry are largely dictated by legal codes and customs that grant you little autonomy. For women in 740, the legal restrictions and their limited property rights were not just obscure statutes. They were foundational pillars of society that profoundly limited their movement and travel. These laws, often unwritten but deeply enforced customs, placed women under the perpetual guardianship of male relatives, fathers, husbands, brothers, and eventually sons, severely constraining their ability to make independent choices about their physical location. In many parts of the world in 740, and particularly within the Germanic kingdoms of Europe and the evolving legal systems of the Byzantine Empire, women were often considered legal minors, regardless of their age. This meant they could not enter into contracts, own property independently, or represent themselves in court without the consent or representation of a male guardian. This legal subjugation had direct implications for movement. If a woman could not legally own property, she could not, for instance, buy a house in a new town, purchase land to settle, or even lease property for a temporary stay while traveling. Her domicile was tied to her male guardians. To move meant her guardian had to move her, or consent to her relocation. Marriage was a pivotal event in a woman's life, and often her legal status would transfer from her father's guardianship to her husband's. Marriage laws often stipulated that a wife was bound to her husband's household and territory. To leave her husband without his permission could be considered abandonment with severe legal and social consequences, potentially leading to destitution, loss of children, or even legal prosecution in some areas. This legal bond fundamentally limited a married woman's ability to travel independently or to relocate without her husband's explicit consent and arrangement. Even if she wished to visit her family in a distant village, her husband's permission was essential. Property rights were intricately linked to this lack of legal autonomy. While some women, particularly in certain Islamic and Roman legal traditions, could theoretically own property, the practicalities of managing it often still fell to male relatives. In many other systems, women had limited inheritance rights, often receiving only a dowry or a share of movable goods, but rarely outright control over land or significant wealth. Without personal assets or control over property, a woman had no independent means to finance travel, settle elsewhere, or even sustain herself if she were to move away from her family unit. The economic dependence stemming from limited property rights created a powerful legal tether to her current household. Consider the implications for widows. While a widow might gain more legal autonomy than a married woman, particularly if she inherited her husband's property, her position was still precarious. She might face pressure to remarry, or her property might be managed by her late husband's male relatives or her own sons. Her freedom of movement, while potentially increased, was still often contingent on the approval and protection of her remaining male family. Even legal aspects related to personal security and contracts limited women's travel. If a woman was traveling and encountered a legal dispute, such as a disagreement with a merchant or a landowner, her inability to represent herself or engage in legal proceedings without a male guardian meant she was incredibly vulnerable. This legal weakness made independent ventures into unfamiliar territories fraught with peril, as she lacked the legal standing to protect herself or her interests. Different regions and cultures had varying degrees of strictness in these laws. For example, some historical interpretations of Islamic law granted women specific rights to own property and engage in trade, potentially offering a sliver more autonomy than in some European contexts. However, even where these legal rights existed on paper, the prevailing social customs and practical realities often meant that women's movement was still heavily constrained by guardianship, economic dependence, and concerns for honor and safety. Legal theory did not always translate directly into lived reality, particularly for the majority of common women. In essence, the legal frameworks and customs of 740 AD, which largely denied women full legal personhood and independent property rights, were a profound and systemic limitation on their movement and travel. By placing women under the perpetual guardianship of men, these laws ensured that their domicile, their ability to conduct transactions, and their capacity to fund journeys were all contingent on male consent and provision. This legal subjugation created a powerful official barrier that bound women to their current location, making independent travel a legal impossibility for most and a highly restricted undertaking for virtually all. Number 1. Social norms, reputation, and honor. Imagine a world where your very presence in a public space, or the mere suggestion of independent movement, could instantly cast a shadow over your family's name, brand you as improper, or even mark you as a pariah. In 740, at more than any physical barrier, legal restriction, or economic hardship, the pervasive web of social norms, the relentless concern for reputation, and the deeply ingrained concept of family honor were perhaps the most severe and insidious limitations on women's movement and travel. These invisible chains, woven into the very fabric of daily life, created a powerful psychological and communal cage, often making independent journeys unthinkable even when theoretically possible. Across diverse cultures of 740, a woman's modesty, chastity, and obedience were intrinsically linked to the honor and standing of her entire family. Conduct was not just a personal matter. It reflected directly on her father, husband, and brothers. Any perceived transgression, any deviation from expected behavior could bring shame and dishonor to the family name, potentially jeopardizing their social status, marriage prospects for other daughters, or even their economic well-being. This immense social pressure meant that families, as well as women themselves, were acutely aware of the need to maintain an impeccable reputation, and a primary way to do this was by restricting women's public appearances and independent movements. For a woman to be seen traveling alone, or without a proper male escort, or without a clear, sanctioned purpose, was often viewed with extreme suspicion. Could suggest impropriety, a lack of male guardianship, or even hint at immoral intentions. Such a sight could invite gossip, speculation, and immediate damage to her reputation. In societies where rumor could ruin a life and social standing was everything, The fear of this judgment was a powerful deterrent. Women were taught from a young age that their place was primarily within the domestic sphere, where their virtue could be safeguarded. The outside world, particularly unfamiliar territories, was seen as a place of moral danger where a woman's honor could be compromised. This concern for reputation meant that even if a woman had a legitimate reason to travel, such as visiting family, engaging in trade, or going on pilgrimage, it had to be done in a manner that meticulously upheld social expectation. This almost invariably meant traveling with a trusted male relative as part of a family group, or within a large, well-guarded caravan, where her presence would be deemed respectable and protected. Presence of male guardians served as a public declaration of her legitimacy and ensured that she was not seen as venturing outside her prescribed role. Travel, therefore, was rarely a personal choice but a collective undertaking, dictated by the needs and perceptions of the family. The concept of honor also played out differently for women, depending on their marital status and social class. For unmarried women, strict chaperonage and limited public exposure were crucial to protecting their virginity and ensuring a good marriage alliance. For married women, fidelity and domesticity were paramount, and unauthorized travel could be perceived as a challenge to her husband's authority, or even a sign of infidelity. Even for women of higher status, whose journeys might be necessary for diplomatic reasons or managing distant estates, their movements would be highly formalized, accompanied by large retinues, and explicitly sanctioned to maintain their dignity and status. The idea of a noblewoman traveling incognito or for personal adventure was culturally almost unimaginable. Furthermore, social norms dictated what was considered appropriate for a woman to do or see. Exposure to unfamiliar people, customs, and behaviors in distant places was often viewed as corrupting or disruptive to a woman's traditional upbringing. The desire to keep women pure and uncontaminated by the outside world was a strong underlying force. This meant that even the thought of venturing far from the familiar, safe confines of her community was often discouraged, not just by external pressures but by internalized beliefs about what a respectable woman should or should not do. Contrast this with men, whose honor was often tied to their bravery, their economic success in the public sphere, or their military prowess. Travel for men, whether for trade, warfare, diplomacy, or pilgrimage, was often seen as a mark of their strength, ambition, and engagement with the world. Their reputation was enhanced by their ventures, while for women, independent ventures risked damaging theirs. This fundamental difference in how honor and reputation were ascribed created a significant gendered divide in mobility. In essence, the invisible yet omnipresent forces of social norms, the relentless concern for reputation, and the deeply ingrained concept of family honor were arguably the most powerful and pervasive limitations on women's movement and travel in 740 AD. These cultural mandates dictated not just what was legally permissible, but what was socially acceptable, and crucially, what was personally thinkable. By tying a woman's virtue and her family's standing to her seclusion and guardedness, society created a powerful psychological cage that often bound women to their homes, making independent journeys a risky gamble with their very identity and the future of their entire lineage.